And it's time for us to at least agree to stand by the numbers that we've agreed to. Mr. President, I thank the Chair and would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I rise today to solely talk about two of my amendments to the Defense Authorization Bill. I will maybe at a later point speak on some of the other amendments I have filed, but I'm not going to offer the amendments at this time. And I first rise to speak on Udall-Corker Amendment 3049. Last year I introduced S. 1798, the Open Burn Pits Registry Act, with Senator Corker. We have met with veterans and active duty members of the military, and they have told us how important it is that we act now on this issue. The Senate Veterans Affairs Committee agrees and has passed the legislation after holding hearings. This week, Senator Corker and I introduced Amendment 3049 to the defense authorization because our veterans and active duty members suffering from exposure to burn pits should not have to wait any longer. I began this work because of service members like Master Sergeant Jesse Baca, a member of the New Mexico Air National Guard, and his wife, Maria. Master Sergeant Baca was stationed in Balad, Iraq, and exposed to burn pits. Because of the burn pits, he has battled cancer, chronic bronchiolitis, bronchiolitis, chemical-induced asthma, brain lesions, TBI, PTSD, and numerous other ailments. He knows firsthand the suffering caused by burn pits and the need for answers. In both Afghanistan and Iraq, open-air burn pits were widely used at forward operating bases. Disposing of trash and other debris was a major challenge. Commanders had to find a way to dispose of the waste while concentrating on the important mission at hand. The solution that was chosen, however, had serious risks. Pits of waste were set on fire, sometimes using jet fuel for ignition. For example, the air samples at Joint Base Balad turned up some nasty stuff: particulate matter, chemicals that form from incomplete burning of coal, oil, and gas, garbage, and other organic substances. Also, volatile organic compounds such as acetone and benzene. Benzene is known to cause leukemia, and dioxins associated with Agent Orange. A scientific study by the American Lung Association found emissions from burning waste contain fine particulate matter, sulfur dioxides, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, and various irritant gases such as nitrogen oxides that can scar the lungs. All of this was in the air, and our veterans have begun to raise the alarm. We are forever in debt for their service, so we must ask the question, how did these burn pits impact the health of our returning heroes? This amendment is a step towards finding the answers we owe them. It is supported by numerous groups, including Burn Pits 360, Veterans of Foreign Wars, the Association of the U.S. Navy, Retired Enlisted Association, Uniformed Services Disabled Retirees, and the National Military Family Association. I urge the Senate to adopt this amendment so that Master Sergeant Baca and his fellow service members and veterans can begin to heal. And now, Mr. President, I want to speak about a second amendment. This is an amendment that deals with the issue of buying American solar. Mr. President, I rise to speak on this amendment only, Udall Amendment number 3150, sponsored by Senators Schumer, Bingaman, and Wyden. Solar power increases energy security for American military installations, but we should be using Buy American compliant solar panels. The Department of Defense is a leader on utilizing solar power, not for environmental reasons, but for energy security reasons. When we use taxpayer funds to support military solar power, we need a level playing field for U.S. solar manufacturers in the contracting process. Today we have U.S. military bases with Chinese solar that violates the trade laws, but there is no U.S. solar on Chinese military bases. The 2011 Defense Authorization Bill took an important step to clarify DOD's Buy American Act requirements and making sure that they apply to solar. My amendment is needed to close existing loopholes in the 2011 Buy American Solar requirements. It would ensure Buy American standards apply to solar on DOD property that is used to meet DOD energy goals. This amendment is nearly identical to the one passed on voice vote last year, but dropped in conference with the House. The change from last year's amendment is a one-year term so that we can test this provision. CBO estimated the cost of this amendment as insignificant. So we know this amendment does not raise costs. The difference in price is very small. Chinese solar now has significant tariffs. Nations who are in the WTO are not discriminated against. Buy American does not bar nations that allow reciprocal access to U.S. firms. Existing exemptions such as availability and cost still apply. We do not expect this to harm DOD's procurement in any way. And I would once again urge the Senate, when we have the opportunity, to adopt this amendment. And so with that, Mr. President, I would note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
A quorum call on the floor of the Senate, and as we wait further action on the Senate floor today, senators continue debating and voting on amendments to the 2013 defense spending bill, including an amendment that they approved unanimously, an amendment that would tighten sanctions on Iran targeting its energy and shipping industries. The Senate will continue working on the bill and likely have a final passage vote on that next week. While the quorum call continues on the floor of the Senate lawmakers have been negotiating this week changes to filibuster rules. Well, this morning on Washington Journal, we spoke with a congressional historian who has more information about that.
And joining us now to make some sense of the changes that you just heard about being debated on the Senate side, Norman Ornstein from the American Enterprise Institute, a longtime follower of Congress. Why is this such a heated issue?
Well, it's been an issue for more than 100 years, certainly. But in the last few years, there's been increasing tension between the parties over the way the filibuster has been used. And in particular, if you look since 2007, there's been a dramatic increase. And it's filibusters being used not the way they were 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago, which is very, very rarely for issues of great national significance. It's ratcheted up to where almost every nomination, almost every bill, including those that ultimately pass unanimously, have raised the bar to 60 votes. So Democrats who've been in the majority now for 6 years have gotten increasingly frustrated over this, frustrated when they had all the reins of power, the White House, the Senate, the House, frustrated even when the House was in the hands of the Republicans. And there's been pressure building to do something to alter the rule. That happens periodically. The last time was 1975. We've clearly reached a flashpoint now.
So we have the technical definition of the filibuster that we'll show to the folks at home.
Yeah.
But could you tell us and step back a little bit, explain exactly what is it and how does it work?
Just to give you a capsule history, Pedro, there was no filibuster at the beginning of the Republic. What happened is in 1805, the presiding officer of the Senate, the Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr, as he was leaving office, said, your rule book, which includes, as it turns out, something that enabled you to stop debate and move to a vote, a motion on the previous question, you ought to clean up the rule book. It's got a lot of things you are not using that are redundant. And they inadvertently took it out. That meant you had no way to stop debate. But if you move forward, basically any senator can deny unanimous consent, which means that's the way the Senate operates, to move forward. And then it takes, to stop the debate from moving forward, at this point, 3/5 of those senators who are a part of the body, or 60 votes if they have the full 100. But you can use it to stop or to continue to debate and block action on the motion to proceed to a bill. Then if you agree to proceed to a bill, you move forward on the debate on the bill itself. You can filibuster that, requiring that bar of 60 votes. If you finally get a bill through and you work a compromise with the House and you have a conference report coming back, you can filibuster that. Each one takes many, many days to overcome. You don't just say, okay, we got 60 votes, let's move forward. If somebody decides to filibuster, you have to file a motion for what's called cloture to block that debate. It has to ripen for 2 days. Then you can have a significant amount of debate before you get to a vote. After you voted for cloture, so you're going to stop debate, now there are 30 hours of post-cloture debate. So if you want to use a filibuster simply to delay things, you can soak up 4, 5, 6, 7 days of floor time, even for something that has no opposition. And what Democrats believe is that Republicans have done this repeatedly to use a phrase that the former Senator Bob Bennett said was Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader's intent, to throw sand in the works, not just to deal with an issue like the civil rights issues or even the Affordable Care Act. And that's what's bringing us to this point of changing things. Here's
your chance to learn about the procedure and potential changes with our guest. If you want to give them a call and ask questions, 202-585-3880 for Democrats, 202-585-3881 for Republicans, 202-585-3882 for Independents. C-SPAN, WJ is our tweet that you can send tweets to, and then you can email us journal@cspan.org. So what is Senator Reid proposing?
But before I get to that, Pedro, let me just make one point, which is this issue is a little bit like the debt ceiling one. Your perspective on it depends on where you sit. So a number of years ago, it was Republicans in the majority with their own president frustrated and talking about how they were going to change the filibuster to enable a majority to act. Now it's flipped around. The same as if it's your president, you say we need to be responsible, let's vote to increase the debt limit, and if it's the other guys, you do it the other way. So we've had this tension develop. But it's younger senators who've pushed this now, and Harry Reid, who resisted for a long time, for just the reasons that I've suggested, he knew that sometime he'd be back in the minority, has now embraced them out of his own frustration. And they're talking about doing two things effectively. One is no longer allowing filibusters on motions to proceed. The idea here is you get one bite at the apple if you're going to filibuster something. There are no motions to proceed on nominations, so this would be for bills. The other is the so-called talking filibuster. Now you can lift your little finger as one senator and say, I'm going to filibuster, and you've still got to go through all of these motions. You don't even have to appear in the Senate at all until there are votes. They're saying, let's go back to what was never really the case, but the Mr. Smith goes to Washington days. If you're going to filibuster, you've got to be on the floor talking. As soon as nobody's ready and willing to talk, then it turns to a majority vote. And here, if you go round the clock, presumably the minority is going to have to show up and have somebody on the floor at all times, and it will provide at least some dramatization of the fact that they're delaying action.
Skin in the game, so to speak, if they really want something done.
One of the real ironies here is the last time the filibuster was changed, which was 1975, the threshold before that was 2/3 of those present and voting. They moved it to 3/5 of the entire Senate. Well, if you think about going round the clock, if you've got a present and voting standard and you're in the minority, you've got to be around. You know, let's say that you decide to go home and sleep, and the majority has 51 senators who are there to make a quorum, and they say we're going to hold a cloture vote. If it's 2/3 of those present and voting, they only need about 35 senators. But if it's 3/5 of the Senate, the majority has to be there and get the 60 votes. And the minority can only have 1 or 2 people around and let everybody else go home. So now they want to turn it around so that the pain is on the minority and not on the majority.
We'll talk a little bit more, but here's some calls. Chicago, Illinois. Steve, you are up first. Democrats line. Hello.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I absolutely agree with Norm Ornstein. I think that the filibuster has been massively abused since at least 2000. And this childish obstinance, this, you know, do anything to stop President Blackie Black, man, is just, it's old. And I think the American people are tired of it.
Let me note one thing that one of the hesitations that some Democrats have now is the House is in the hands of the Republicans. So if your goal here is to get legislation through, and they're not going to eliminate the filibuster, they're just going to put the pressure on the Republicans, this may help you get bills through the Senate, but it isn't going to help with the House. And if they do it through the method that they're talking about, which for a time was called the nuclear option, instead of doing it through the normal practice, which is if you're going to do a rules change at the beginning of a Congress, that can be filibustered and requires 2/3 of those present and voting. If you do it that way, the Republicans have indicated that they will go to DEFCON 1 and block all action in the Senate, that it's unprecedented, never happened. And you've got to be careful about what the costs and benefits are. That's part of the debate that's going on now. But as the caller said, there's a lot of frustration out there because of a belief that this is a misuse of the rule.
How much of this is bolstered by the changes in the Senate because of the last election?
Democrats added 2 seats, which was pretty stunning, but they also added a number of very feisty new members, people like Elizabeth Warren, who have made filibuster reform a major issue. And let's face it, a part of it is because Elizabeth Warren really was blocked from being able to take over the position of the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau because of holds and filibusters. And a hold, which people have heard about a lot, used mostly on nominations, is basically a formal notification by an individual senator that he or she will deny unanimous consent and in effect would filibuster, which is usually the death blow to a nominee if it's never lifted.
Charlestown, Rhode Island, Republican line. Al, good morning.
Good morning. Pedro, I hope you give me a few minutes like you give a lot of other people. Mr. Ornstein, I agree. The one thing they should do with the Senate. If somebody gets up and filibusters, they should have to stay on the floor and make their point and argue their point. But what I also called about, Pedro, is the president ran on class warfare. I think the Republicans should give him class warfare right back, and I'll tell you how we should do it.
Well, let's stick to the point at hand. If you had another question about what we're talking about as far as Senate rules and filibuster, go ahead with that, but we're going to have to move on.
I want to do an independent audit in every state on the welfare.
Hamilton, Ohio. Jack on our independent line. Hi.
Hey, hi, how are you doing? I thought we were still on the White House budget proposal, but if we're talking about the filibuster rules, in my opinion, I think the filibuster itself, not only has it been abused, but I think it's an internal power struggle. Some rules made up by the congressional and the House and the White House, Senate, all those guys and women. To me, it seems like it's a power struggle. If the Democrats feel like they have power in the Senate but not the House, so now they want to change the rules. If it was the other way around, the Republicans would do the same thing. I think it's a shame, and the American public should really look at this and recognize the political framework around this and why they're actually doing that. But my comment that I want to talk about the budget is that Social Security, Medicaid...
Okay, caller, I'm sorry. I had to let the other caller call because I wanted to keep it to this topic. I'm going to have to do the same to you. But to the minority party's point, there's a relation, if I understand it correctly, between this process and the ability to add amendments to bills as it goes along. Could you explain that?
And there's you could view it as a chicken and egg issue. The majority gets frustrated by the threats of filibusters, and the majority leader has a lot of power in the Senate to frame debate. So what a majority leader can do is a process known technically as filling the amendment tree. And basically, through his power of recognition, he can put in a number of amendments at every different degree and block any other amendments from moving forward. Majority leaders of both parties have used this to varying degrees. It's occurred more and more. And frankly, it's used sometimes because you want to get away from too many filibusters, but it's also used at times because the leader doesn't want embarrassing amendments that might be politically damaging to his members. And so Republicans have a legitimate gripe here that they want to have vehicles to protest when they aren't able to allow amendments. One of the proposals that's been out there, in this case now it's been fleshed out and formalized by Carl Levin, one of the senior and most respected members of the Senate, is basically a trade-off. We will end filibusters on the motions to proceed. We will give you a guarantee of timely and relevant amendments. And this is also something that's been discussed frequently in the hearings in the Rules Committee in the Senate, and I've testified a number of times, by Chairman Chuck Schumer and the ranking member, Lamar Alexander. There are seeds for a compromise here that could work. And, you know, the last time the filibuster rule was changed in 1975, it started with a shockwave. The Vice President, Nelson Rockefeller, nobody knew it was coming, announced at the beginning of the new session, the Senate's not a continuing body. Despite the fact that two-thirds of the members are there at any time, it can change its rules by majority. They said, whoa, time out, and they worked out this bipartisan compromise that moved it from two-thirds of present voting to three-fifths of the Senate. You could see that happening again, where there's the threat of doing this by a unilateral majority vote action, and that brings McConnell, Alexander, and others to the table. And Reid and his colleagues agree that they'll be much more open with amendments in return for a change that would ratchet down the frivolous and obstructionist use of the filibuster.
If the Democrats in the Senate wanted to do this, what's the time frame?
Well, you know, the way it would usually work is you do it right the first day, January 3rd. New Senate opens, just as the House sets its new rules on that first day. But the original proposal for what's called the nuclear option, which Republicans had thrown on the table some years ago over judicial nominations, said we'll do it at any time. And, you know, not to get too technical, but it's basically somebody says to the presiding officer, we want to know what the parliamentary ruling is on whether you can end debate, in this case, with a simple majority. The parliamentarian would advise him that that's what the rules what the rules say is no, you need the filibuster. You appeal the ruling of the chair, and that can be done by a majority. So there's a slippery way around it, which you could do at any time. And one of the things that could potentially happen here too is that Harry Reid will say to Mitch McConnell, tell you what, you've said you're going to stop this frivolous use of filibusters. We'll check that out for a while. I'll give you some amendments. If it isn't working at any time, we'll just change it unilaterally.
I suspect this is delivered a bit with tongue-in-cheek, but Joseph Ramirez asked, Mr. Ornstein, with the present filibuster rule, who needs elections?
You know, one of the things that has happened is if you raise the bar to 60 votes, it's not at all clear that that is what either the framers had in mind or that it fits even a model of like a parliamentary government where if you have all the reins of power, at least you can act. And that's been one of the considerations for the last few years. It's not the way that things had worked in the past. And, you know, the other part of this is it's a cultural problem as much as anything. The filibuster used to be a very good way, the threat of it. If you need 60, the majority has to reach out to the minority to try and find some bipartisan compromise. Now it's being used as a party weapon, which drives compromise further apart. So what we're all looking for, those of us who want a process that works the way the framers intended and that has that compromise, is a cultural change, and at this point it probably takes a rules change to bring about that cultural change.
Our guest has thoughts on the role or the filibuster rule and potential changes in an op-ed that he wrote this week, a bipartisan way to overhaul filibuster rules.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, in a moment I'm going to call up a list of 9 amendments which have been cleared by Senator McCain and myself. We expect that there will be in perhaps an hour or so an additional list of perhaps 15 or 20 cleared amendments. And shortly thereafter, it would be our expectation to propound a unanimous consent proposal with a finite list of amendments that would be considered before final passage. And at the time that we do that, we would give our colleagues perhaps 20 minutes after we read that proposed unanimous consent agreement to come to the floor if they choose and talk to us about it, and if they so choose to object. We hope that won't happen, obviously. We've worked very hard with colleagues, but nonetheless, that's the procedure that we're planning on following. And I would now call up a list of 9 amendments which have been cleared, as I've indicated before. McCain Amendment number 3052, White House Amendment number 3075, Snow Amendment number 3133, Sanders Amendment number 3182, Sanders Amendment number 3183, Warner Amendment number 3233, Coburn Amendment number 3236, Sanders Amendment number 3248, and Rubio Amendment number 3283.
Is there objection? Without objection, the amendments will be considered en bloc.
Move to reconsider the vote.
Is there further debate on the amendments? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it.
Move to reconsider.
The amendments are agreed to en bloc.
Move to reconsider.
Lay on the table.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, there's going to be another hour in here where people have an opportunity to come to the floor and to check on their amendments, and we hope that our colleagues will take advantage of that opportunity.
Mr. President, I hope our colleague staffs who are observing our deliberations here would think seriously about their amendments and how they can be consolidated, whether they are really need to be considered or not. We are working through large numbers of amendments, and we will be probably revealing a finite list, and we hope that we can satisfy all members' concerns. I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President. Senator from
And I also ask that I be recognized as if in more business to offer tribute.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'd like to take a moment to honor a member of my staff who's not retiring, but through his ailment can no longer come and work on the Hill. This gentleman's name is Michael Schwartz. He's been my chief of staff for almost 15 years while I was in the House and here as well. A lot of people on the Hill know Michael. And what they know is he's one of the kindest, gentlest people that anyone has ever met. He's been a light on how you do things to honor other people. Mike has always has been the kind of person that has always focused on others, especially those in need. He's the kind of person that doesn't pass up the homeless that we all see around the Capitol, but stops and tries to supply their need, offers them money and food, but he also offers them friendship and his time. He offers them the love and dignity that comes from being reminded that we're all children of the Creator. Mike has also been an unapologetic defender of the family and for those who cannot defend themselves, whether that be the disability community, the unborn, the infirm, or the elderly. He has reminded me and my staff and us that a society is truly measured in how it treats and cares for those less fortunate. Mike's also a voracious reader and gifted leader. In a city where people stop learning when they gain power, Mike has shown that the closer you get to power, the more you need to humble yourself and learn new things. He's been mentoring staff and others for years on the Hill in both reading groups and Bible studies, and where he has shared his wisdom, his faith, and his heart. As many in the Senate know, Mike has ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. For weeks he's been battling, actually months, he's been battling to continue to fulfill his responsibilities here when most of us would have said, it's too difficult, I can't do it. He's overcome challenges that most of us can scarcely imagine. He's done so with grace, humility, and an unbelievable level of courage. And through this, we have seen that he has inspired everybody on my team with both his spirit and his tenacity. And in these difficult circumstances, Mike has been an extraordinary servant and faithful leader. He's still the guy that cares more about other people than himself. The kindness he has shown to everyone he's encountered, whether to a homeless person on the street or a leading senator in the halls, he has reminded our team and me that we are all equal, regardless of position, in the eyes of God. Let me close with a passage from 2 Corinthians that reminds me so very much of Mike. It is written, I believe, therefore I have spoken. Since we have that same spirit of faith, we also believe and therefore speak, because we know that the one who raised the Lord Jesus will also raise us with Jesus and present us to himself. All this is for your benefit so that the grace that is reaching more and more people, grace, that wonderful word grace, too often shortage in Washington that Mike so well displays, may cause people thanksgiving to overflow for the glory of God. Therefore, do not lose heart. Mike, don't lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on the seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary and what is unseen is eternal. In a place preoccupied by titles and position and power, Mike has shown everyone by his life and his deeds and his words that things that are unseen are the things that matter. He has shown us what it means to run the race and finish it strong. Well done, good and faithful servant. My hope is that God will bless Mike and Roseanne, their children and grandchildren, as he closes his chapter of life on the Hill. He will still be doing projects for us because of his intellect, his insight, and his knowledge is something we cannot bear to do without. So it has been my privilege over the last 15 years to be modeled and mentored by my Chief of Staff. Mike, we love you. God bless you. I yield the floor. And note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
While the Senate is in this quorum call, we're going to take you to the Heritage Foundation for a discussion underway on the Senate filibuster. Current and former Capitol Hill staffers are discussing the history of the filibuster and proposals to make it harder for senators to use the filibuster to block legislation.
All of the amendments that are required or allowed under the rules, no other member can offer an amendment until those are taken down. And he doesn't take those down until he's filed cloture, typically on the same day of the bill that it's been on the floor, and shuts out all other amendments that can be offered and then goes to the final vote and lets the clock run out. Reid has done this more than anyone else, we've all read the information on that. But I find this incredibly persuasive when it is used in tandem with the same-day cloture rule. Because Reid will say, well, I will fill the tree because I want to block bad amendments, that these amendments they're just partisan ploys, they're merely symbolic, they're designed to score political points, and this is not real deliberation. That's what he also says about filibusters and cloture motions. But when you take same-day cloture motions and you combine them with filling the tree, you've basically done two things. You've truncated debate, and you have excluded the minority's ability to participate in the process. And in the 110th Congress, 56% of all the bills that had a same-day cloture motion, the tree was filled. In the 111th, 98% of all of those bills, the tree was filled. 98%. And in the 112th, I mean, we're not done yet, so we're still going, but it's likely to even exceed that. And lastly, I think I would like to say that there's some new developments in agenda control that the Senate Majority Leader is now using, in addition to same-day closure and filling the tree. One is picking minority amendments that they filed to the exclusion of other minority amendments, and then making a public argument that the minorities now had a chance to offer the amendments, just not the ones they wanted to offer, not the ones that are on their priority list, but ones they just filed anyway. And so, you know, they're complaining about voting against cloture because they don't get amendments isn't really legitimate. We've seen that a number of times. I think it's a very important development. And lastly, it's this thing I like to call a blocker motion to proceed. In the Senate, the only power the Majority Leader has is priority of recognition. He gets to be recognized before everybody else. That allows him to offer amendments. He also, by tradition, makes motions to proceed to things, cloture motions, motions to proceed, those things, because the senators have a vested interest in ensuring that the schedule is very orderly. Well, as he's truncated an ability to participate in the process by any member, not just the minority party, but also his own members, what you've seen happen is more and more senators are saying, well, I'm not going to defer to you anymore to move to proceed to bills that you want to, because we are so frustrated with what's happening, we may also want to move to proceed to our own bills. And so what you've seen happen now is that the Majority Leader will use all of these tools together, where he will file cloture on a bill the same day it is brought to the floor. He will fill the amendment tree to block out all other amendments, and then he will do what I like to call a blocker motion to proceed. He will move to proceed to another bill while the clock is running on that cloture motion to prevent any other member from coming down there to even move to proceed to a bill that he doesn't agree with. And then after 2 days, and he has no intention of actually getting on that bill, after 2 days the cloture vote on the original bill will come up, we'll invoke cloture or not, and then we'll go on about our business. And so he's basically done everything he possibly can to control the agenda in the Senate in much the same way that majority parties seek to control the agenda in the House. And I think that this is a very significant development, and it, I think, helps us when we have this conversation. I think it's important to keep this in mind, because it's not necessarily a given that cloture motions are the same as a minority filibuster that needs to be curtailed. So, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Mike. I'm delighted to be here. I promise not to speak for more than 6 or 6.5 hours. Let me start with just clearing out a little bit of the underbrush that I think a lot of people hold about filibusters. First is filibusters, unlimited debate, supermajorities to end debate are not in the Constitution, weren't envisioned by the framers. The initial Senates actually had something that the House has, which is critical to moving to action, which is a motion on the previous question, a way in which you have a simple majority to stop debate and move to a vote. In 1805, the President of the Senate, Vice President Aaron Burr, went for his farewell to the Senate and said, you know, you got a rule book, it's already become encrusted with a bunch of things, duplicative, and many of them you don't even use. Why don't you just clean up the rule book, and here are some ideas. And they basically said, okay, and adopted a set of rules that took out the motion on the previous question. And it wasn't clear in the Senate for a while what that meant. That it basically meant that if one senator took the floor and kept talking, or a group of senators did that, that you could block action and block it indefinitely. And there was no way to stop it until 1917, when we had a crisis, really, over rearming prior to entry into the First World War, which was the first time we had a rule that actually created a process where you could end that debate. It's been amended a number of times since then. But a lot of people think this is enshrined in the Constitution, and it's not, nor was the supermajority. So that out of the way, let me just add a couple of other observations. The rule's been changed a number of times. Most significantly, the last time was in 1975. In 1975, when it was changed, you had a shockwave go through the political arena because Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, with nobody else realizing that he was about to do this, at the beginning of the new Congress announced that the Senate was not a continuing body. And the Senate basically said, whoa, time out, went back, contemplated what would happen if the Rockefeller ruling stood, and it would change the Senate, and decided, with Robert Byrd leading the way, to come up with a bipartisan agreement that would not allow that to happen. That changed the filibuster, and the fundamental change was moving at that point from a requirement to end debate to invoke cloture of 2/3 of those present and voting down to 3/5 of the Senate. And I would argue, and will in a minute, that that change, which seemed to lower the threshold, actually altered the Senate in a fundamental way, and it meant that the whole idea, if it's an issue of significance where the majority leader decides to bring the place to a halt and go round the clock, basically went away, because there was no incentive for the minority, if it didn't want to actually take to the floor to dramatize an issue, to come to the floor when it was now the burden on the majority to provide 60 votes. But the rule has been in place since 1975. And that leads us to another conclusion, which is if there are problems with the filibuster and issues now, which obviously there are, it's not because of the rule. Because the fact is that from 1975 really until 2007, while there were brief periods of problems, of flare-ups, of frustration, every majority has felt the frustration of a minority being able to use the tool. And the minority, by the way, has not always, in fact, rarely has been simply a party acting together. Sometimes it's been an individual rogue member of your own party. Democrats had that frustration with Jim Abourezk of South Dakota, with Howard Metzenbaum of Ohio. Democrats and Republicans had it with James Allen of Alabama, with Jesse Helms, and there have been a number of others. Sometimes it's been factional. But it hasn't been a party-based process. But there were, periods when there was great frustration. But mostly, the Senate went along and worked because it's a body of individuals and a body where the party leaders have tended to try to work things out, sometimes to isolate those individuals, because the Senate's also a place which basically operates and has to, under a broader set of rules than the filibuster, by consensus, because almost everything requires unanimous consent. But things changed, and it was a cultural change, really. It's a cultural change that had been building before that period of time. It was a cultural change that, as no doubt we will hear, frustrated the hell out of Bill Frist when he was majority leader, and it's one that has affected every majority leader before and since. But it's changed rather dramatically since. And the change is really of two parts. The first is that for the first time, really, that I can see ever, you have a party acting in unison, using the filibuster on a regular basis as a tool. Now, if you look at prominent examples of the use of the filibuster in the past, and remember, through most of the history in which it existed and even in which we've had supermajority or cloture rules to end debate, it was used very, very rarely, and it was used on issues of great national significance where a minority felt very intensely about it. We're willing to put everything on the line to make it happen. But in the Civil Rights era, for example, when we had those celebrated filibusters, they weren't partisan in a sense, they were factional. The fact is the filibusters done by Southern Democratic senators to oppose civil rights or voting rights legislation were opposed by Republicans, just as they were by non-Southern Democrats. And the fact is that civil rights legislation and overcoming those filibusters and being enacted was at least as much to the credit and responsibility of Everett Dirksen, the Senate Minority Leader, as to Lyndon Johnson. So what we've seen now is a regular use of the filibuster now as a partisan tool, and not just a group of members of a party, but the entire party as fashioned by the minority leader. The second is the use of the filibuster routinely, not on issues of great national significance, and not simply on those issues where the majority leader fills the amendment tree, but on issues and nominations which ultimately pass unanimously or near unanimously. And keep in mind on nominations where holds, which are notices that you will deny unanimous consent, and in some instances have been filibustered, not just on judicial nominations, but a lot of them now on executive nominations, you don't have amendments to nominations. You don't have a process where you would basically have a protest in order. And they have been used simply and frequently as some of us call them weapons of mass obstruction. Now, why and how do we know that this is the case? Among other things, there's some very interesting reporting done by Michael Grunwald, a journalist who wrote a terrific book called The New Deal, following up on something that Joe Biden said after he became vice president, and he said right afterwards he went to the Senate to talk to some of his Republican colleagues whom he'd known, many of them for the full 36 years that he'd been there, and he said 7 of them told him, never mind, we won't be cooperating, Joe. We've got orders here. We're going to block everything that you do. And Grunwald went around and talked to senators to try and find some, and found a few off the record and one on the record, Bob Bennett, who was the lieutenant to Mitch McConnell, who said, well, yes, Mitch has told us all that we're going to try and block everything we can, and if we can't block it, we're going to throw as much sand in the works as we can. And of course, the process of filibustering, which requires the 2 days for the cloture motion to ripen, a lot of time on the floor as you go through this process, and then if you achieve cloture, allowing 30 hours of post-cloture debate. And you can demand the full 30 hours and you don't even have to debate. Becomes a very tempting tool to use to soak up an enormous amount of floor time. Because if you have an ambitious agenda as a majority, floor time becomes a very precious commodity. And it's that process, and you can point to examples of bills and nominations that ultimately passed unanimously that were taken through, in the case of bills, in many instances, a filibuster on the motion to proceed, which ended up with a cloture motion that passed overwhelmingly, but then another filibuster on the bill itself. And then we often see filibusters on conference reports if and when they come back, all designed to simply use up more floor time. So that's the frustration of the majority. Now we can get to the frustration of the minority. And the fact is we do have something that in part is a chicken and egg problem. It is the case, and we saw it with Trent Lott, we saw it with Bill Frist, we've seen it with Harry Reid, that majority leaders want to move things along and also don't want amendments that are politically embarrassing. So there is a temptation to fill the amendment tree, and there are many instances in which Harry Reid has done that, and there is a very legitimate complaint on the part of minorities and on the part of the Republican minority here on that front as well. So what do you do about all this? Well, in an ideal world, and I would like to see something closer to an ideal world, you don't go back to the process either that Nelson Rockefeller had proposed, that Vice President Walter Mondale had suggested, that has actually come up from time to time, which is to say the Senate's not a continuing body, we're just going to change the rules by majority. You don't use the option at any time during the session, which Majority Leader Frist had proposed, what was then called the so-called nuclear option, of using the rules and the presiding officer by majority in midstream, after you've already basically ratified the rules, to make a change. You may use that option at the beginning as a shock value to bring people together, but ideally you'd get an agreement that would satisfy some of the grievances of both the minority and the majority. Now, we have one proposal on the table by Democratic Senator Carl Levin, one of the most respected senior members of the Senate, which is basically we will provide opportunities for timely and relevant amendments and a process for getting those, and it can be lots of them, on the table. In return, we'll cut off filibusters on the motion to proceed and clean up the process a little bit more. If I had my druthers, I would take it a few steps further. First of all, I think some of the options for using the filibuster as a tool of obstruction, including the 30 hours of post-cloture debate. It used to be 100 hours. They cut it back to 30. I see no reason why you can't, at minimum, say 30 hours divided between the majority and the minority, and you have to be on the floor debating if you're going to take the 15 hours that you have. I see no reason why you can't expedite action even a little bit further. So if you want to raise the bar to 60, you can do it, but you've got to move a little further. And then I would do one of two things, because I think what's happened here in particular, and what's made this a tool that becomes particularly attractive to use on a more regular basis, is that since 1975, basically the way the process has worked, it's put the onus on the majority to move to action, instead of what really was the whole idea behind a filibuster as it developed over time, which is a minority, whether it's a partisan, ideological, regional, or other kind of minority, that feels so intensely about an issue that it is willing to sacrifice enormously to make its point of view known and to block as long as it can. That's appropriate. But you can do it in one of two ways. The simplest is to return to a standard. In this case, it would be 3/5 of those present and voting. Then if you decide, and it's only going to be on an issue of great significance, that you're going to go round the clock, it's going to be up to the majority to make sure they've got their members waiting close by, because if they're not, if at 3 in the morning they've decided, we'll let the majority keep at least 50 of its members there because you can have note the absence of a quorum, and they've got to be around to keep the debate going, and the minority only needs 1 or 2 people around to note the absence of a quorum and to prevent any destructive unanimous consent agreement. They've got to show up, because otherwise, if there are only 60 senators there, you can invoke cloture with 40. Or my preference, because it deals with the larger number of potentially frivolous amendments, is to switch the burden from 60 senators in the majority to 41 in the minority. You want to keep debate going, you better produce 41 votes on a regular basis. And that would end what I view as a farce that we saw a couple of times a couple of years ago, which was the Democrats being forced to drag 92-year-old Harry Byrd out of his hospital bed to come to the floor to provide that 60th vote. The burden shouldn't be on the majority if a minority feels intensely about this. It ought to be on the minority. There are ways of doing these things that ought to meet with a broader approval. It doesn't end the filibuster. It doesn't end the ability of a minority of whatever sort to raise that bar, but it puts the burden where it belongs, and it also gives the minority back something which it deserves, even if they happen to be politically embarrassing amendments, the right to offer amendments. And I'll just make one final point. I would like to see further changes when it comes to executive nominations. The biggest dispute we had in the past was over filibustering judicial nominations. Frankly, I don't have a problem with filibustering judicial nominations because they're lifetime appointments. And you're not just talking about the preference of a president. You're talking about something that will be there, someone who will be there potentially for 20, 30, or 40 years after a president leaves office. These ought to have the highest level of scrutiny and standard, even though they ought to be used rarely. But executive nominations are different. There ought to be if not a bias, at least a bent in favor of a president being able to have his or her nominees in place in the executive branch. And so this is one instance where I could see a process of reducing the level required for cloture gradually down to a majority. Allow time for debate, allow time for consideration, but let a president have his or her people in place. Thank you.
So my question is this: does it really matter what happens to a few Senate parliamentary procedures? Does it have anything to do with the health of our nation or the future of our nation? I suppose if you don't think so, you're probably not sitting here in the audience or watching online. But the founders of our nation thought it mattered. In fact, they labored many months during the Constitutional Convention to get it right and spent many hundreds of pages in the Federalist Papers arguing for that Constitution. It's true, what Dr. Ornstein says, that the filibuster was not part of the Constitution or even of the original Senate. Not until 1806 was a filibuster even possible. But the spirit of the filibuster was resident in the founders' conception of what the Senate should be. And diluting the rights of the Senate minority is not just a question of whose partisan ox is getting gored today, but it goes to the heart of what the founders' concerns are about preserving minority rights and ensuring that deliberation is permitted to improve lawmaking. Now, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid is poised to engage in a power grab for his party and will have consequences beyond the 113th Congress. Sometimes, if he's successful, it will help Democrats. Sometimes it will help Republicans. But it will rarely help the American people. And it will serve to reduce the quality of new laws that are being made and further exacerbate the toxic political environment by reducing collaborative and conciliatory compromises that help to civilize our national politics. 3 points I want to make today. First is that we are not a democracy, but we're a republic, and why that matters. Second, the Senate was intended to be a check on the passions of the House so as to preserve minority rights and that will might prevail. And third, more deliberation produces better legislation. First, we're a republic, not a democracy. First, the founders did not form a democracy, but a republic, and few Americans know this today. And in fact, if you are apt, as I am, as a political theorist, to say we're a republic, not a democracy, people look at you and they're saying, oh, there he is making that pedantic point. But they've lost the understanding of the difference between the two. Democracy never appears in the Constitution. I remember asking during my 10th grade high school civics class, what was wrong with Jean-Jacques Rousseau's democracy? What was wrong with the French Revolution? How was that really different than ours? And I remember the teacher being at a loss to explain the difference because it was clear he didn't really know. Our republic is not founded on the notion of vox populi, vox dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God. You get 50% plus one, that's justice. The framers had a different notion. They believed that justice exists and was there to be not to be determined, but to be discovered. And they therefore put in those less democratic elements of the Constitution and our new government precisely so that justice could be better achieved. It wasn't, as some would contend, that it was anachronistic, they couldn't see beyond their own cultural blinders, they wanted to protect slavery. No. They believed that the simple majority rule in every case does not always produce justice or the best result. The founders themselves had very tough words for democracy. Let me just read a few of them. James Madison said, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention." Fisher Ames, who authored the First Amendment in the House, said, "The known propensity of a democracy is to licentiousness, which the ambitious call and the ignorant believe to be liberty." Governor Morris said, "Democracy is savage and wild." And Benjamin Rush said, "A simple democracy is one of the greatest of evils." The point is that the undemocratic elements of the Constitution are there on purpose. Among these, the veto, the indirect election at the time of the U.S. senators by state legislatures, the independent judiciary, the bicameral legislature. Next point, loss of minority rights. The Senate is one of these less democratic elements of the government for a good reason. Its purpose is to check the majoritarian impulse of the majoritarian House and preserve minority rights. I was a creature of the House before I was a creature of the Senate, and like every good House staffer, I hated the Senate for my 15 years in there because it was the graveyard for all the legislation that we wanted to push through. I later went on to the Senate, sat at the feet of Marty Gold, who's the, I think, foremost expert on Senate parliamentary procedure, and came to appreciate the importance of the Senate anew, and then went to the White House. So I am trilingual in a way, and I understand it from each of these perspectives. There's a story that is probably apocryphal, but it's too good because it captures the truth about the Senate. Namely that when Jefferson, who had been at our ambassador to France during the Constitutional Convention, came back and he sat with Washington for breakfast, he asked, so what was the deal going on? Why'd you do the second bicameral body, the Senate? And Washington said, didn't you just now pour that coffee into your saucer before drinking it? To cool it, said Jefferson. Of course, my throat is not made of brass. Washington replied, even so, we pour our legislation into the senatorial saucer to cool it. The House is made for speed. Shorter terms of 2 years ensure closer connection to the electorate. The smaller districts make for representation a little bit more correlative. But the Senate was made to be a brake. It was made as a speed bump and often as a dead end. The seeds of the filibuster were planted in the Constitution itself, but they sprouted in 1806, as Dr. Ornstein said, when the Senate changed its rules to make it unable to shut off debate, and indeed the first filibuster didn't even occur until 1837. Cloture wasn't established until 1917, which was the two-thirds of those voting, and then not until 1975 was cloture reduced to the current 60 votes. But the presence of the possibility of a filibuster during that whole period was hugely significant on how the Senate went about its business. It was hung like Damocles' sword above the chamber in all that it did, and it forced conciliation and compromise in order to move legislation. The filibusters were really relatively rare until recent years, but they constantly forged a kind of entirely different kind of body, as any House member who's gone on to serve in the Senate will tell you. Marty Gold talks about the House being the place where the offense is in the primacy, and in the Senate, the defense is in the primacy. House minorities, as I knew for 7 years in the House, in a House minority, get crushed. Now, this minority strength has a salutary effect in the Senate on legislation in that it tempers the momentary political passions that are moving through the House and ensuring that the more enduring will, the will of the American people, is more likely to triumph over the passions. It does hobble Congress. It does make it less efficient, but as we know, that was not the main aim of the framers in efficient government. And to the extent that the Senate becomes a mirror image of the House, which we're seeing with the one-man Rules Committee named Harry Reid, will still have the benefits of a bicameral legislature, but they're going to be tempered, and the deliberation especially is going to be hurt. That's the third point. Deliberation is really this proposed power grab by the current majority will undermine deliberation that's really intended to improve legislation. The issue is not whether or not Harry Reid will continue his unprecedented efforts to fill the amendment tree, as Dr. Walner mentioned, and prevent the minority from offering amendments to improve legislation. I mean, that's hugely important. And in fact, Senator Reid told Senator McCain, quote, that the days of amendments are over. And he told a new senator that instead of being able to offer amendments to improve legislation, he could, quote, always vote against the bill. That's how it is in the House of Representatives quite often, especially with a closed rule or under suspension of the rules. That's not the way it's supposed to be in the Senate. The minority would no longer have the rights to improve legislation, according to Harry Reid, through the amendment process, but just be given a binary choice on the legislation, yay or nay. Congressional Research Service has found that Senator Reid has blocked senators from offering amendments 68 times since he's been the majority leader. That's 70 times greater than the number of times the 6 prior majority leaders combined blocked the offerings of amendments. I remember when I worked for Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, and a Republican senator would come to us and ask for the amendment tree to be filled to block out amendments. I remember the reaction inside our office. It was done very rarely, and we said, no, that creates an explosion in the Senate because that's violative of minority rights. We did it just 15 times, Senator Frist did, when he was majority leader. And when senators can't offer amendments, it means their constituents are disempowered. In contrast, deliberation promotes justice. That's what the framers believed. Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist Paper number 70, said this: "In the legislature, promptitude of decision is oftener an evil than a benefit. The differences of opinion and the jarrings of parties in that department of the government, though they may sometimes obstruct salutary plans, yet often promote deliberation and circumspection and serve to check excesses in the majority." This was a constant and enduring fear of the framers. So while the filibuster was not in the original Senate and was not in the Constitution, the seeds of it certainly were, and it was very important to the framers that the Senate act as that check. Am I arguing there's a perfect number for cloture? No. There have been changes made over the years, as we've already discussed. But the drift, the direction, the trajectory is bad for deliberation. I want to close with these words from then outgoing liberal Democratic Senator Christopher Dodd, who in his farewell speech on the Senate floor in 2010 said this: "The history of this young democracy," the framers decided, "should not be written solely in the hands of a political majority. In a nation founded in revolution against tyrannical rule, which sought to crush dissent, there should be one institution that would always provide a space where dissent was valued and respected. Our founders were concerned not only with what was legislated, but just as importantly, with how we legislated." Thank you.
I'm Brian Darling, Senior Fellow for Government Studies here at the Heritage Foundation. My feeling is that the current push to reform the filibuster is merely a partisan power grab by Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid with the support of President Barack Obama. He wants to terminate the procedure that allows members to filibuster a motion to proceed. He wants to force a so-called talking filibuster. But he wants to do so, and the way he wants to do so, he would have to break the rules to change the rules. He would use a so-called nuclear option, which we've been discussing, which is when the majority leader forces a change to precedent of the rules with a simple majority vote. Now, putting the substance of the changes that we've been talking about aside, it's important to note that the Senate's rules have never been changed while following the rules and following the regular, without following the regular order, without following the rules. There have been changes to precedent in the interpretation of the rules using the nuclear option with a simple majority. Yet the rules have never, ever been changed without using the regular order. You look back to 1979, Senate Majority Leader Robert C. Byrd at that time did use a version of the nuclear option to change the debate, the nature of the debate, when debating executive nominations, but that was a change in precedent. It's never ever happened that the Senate has changed the rules by breaking the rules. Now, Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution gives the Senate and the House the right to set its own rules. According to Senate Rule 5, the Senate rules continue from one Congress to another. According to Rule 22, you need a two-thirds majority to change the rules of the Senate, to shut down debate on changing the rules of the Senate before you have a simple majority vote on these issues. Now, Rule 5 exists because the Senate is a continuing body, with most of its members carrying over from the previous Congress. Now, when the Senate convenes in the next Congress, what's going to happen is 1/3 of the senators get sworn in, but the other 2/3 are going to continue to maintain their membership in the United States Senate. You're not going to see Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid or Senate Republican Leader Mitch McConnell being sworn in. They remain members of the institution because they have been previously elected and they continue their membership. But what you will see is you'll see 1/3 of the Senate will be sworn in under the existing Senate rules. The first thing the Senate's going to do when they convene in the next Congress is to use the Senate rules to swear in all the new members. And that undercuts the fiction that Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid is trying to promote, that somehow the rules are suspended or they're not actually being implemented in a new Congress when you start up that first day. We're hearing this argument that that first day you come into session in the new Congress, there are no rules. Yet, all the new senators get sworn in under Rule 3.
Quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.